Welcome to our first episode of Season 2 of HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, their.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she and her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the Revised Common Lectionary readings for the season of Advent in Year C, because we've started a new church year, the Year of Luke. One note for this episode is that in Advent 2, when we're talking about our first reading, we do talk about abuse in the context of bad theology.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode. So we're on Year C, and in Year C, we mostly hear from the Gospel of Luke. I love Luke. Luke is my favorite. I like to think of Luke as being the prisoner of Azkaban of the Gospels. It's well written, it's evocative, and I don't know who Luke used to edit it, but I think they did a pretty good job. Luke also has way more women who have actual names and who talk than the other Gospels, by far. Which is pretty fabulous. Women are just everywhere in Luke. Which makes me wonder. I wonder how the books would have been different if the Weasleys had had 6 girls and 1 boy instead of the other way around.
Ooh, interesting. Yeah, would Harry...
Rowena Weasley instead of Ron?
Yeah, would they have actually, become friends in the very beginning? Would they have been as likely to be friends, or would Harry have, I don't know how to...
Found a different carriage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's a good question. Also, one of the kind of overarching themes of Advent is a waiting or a yearning for what is to come in the midst of what is, which is frequently not great. I've been on a Order of the Phoenix kick lately, as you probably all know, but that I think about Advent in general as kind of an Order of the Phoenix where things are just awful and you're waiting for things to change and for things to be different, and there's a struggle to get to that point, and sometimes you see glimpses of it and sometimes it feels like it's nowhere to be seen.
For those of you who are familiar with the church season of Lent, Lent and Advent have a lot in common. They're both somewhat more contemplative, more quiet church seasons than a lot of the others. Yes, that's a good word. But Lent is about changing yourself and seeing the faults in yourself. Advent is about looking around at the world and saying, this is why we need God. I would say. And
yearning for God, yearning for Jesus.
Yes. And Advent is a season we don't always like because we're not very good at waiting these days.
Oh my gosh.
I don't think people have ever been good at waiting. But
I always say that patience is a virtue that I don't have.
Also, many people like to give names to the Sundays of Advent, or themes to them. Love, joy, hope, etc. I don't know. People come up with different ones.
I heard it was hope, peace, joy, and love for the 4th, but I don't know.
I have heard several different versions, and every congregation I've gone to has a different version, it seems like. And some of them are very enthusiastic about it, and do not change it under any circumstances. The only one that is really in any way official, as far as I know, the official names for the Advent Sundays are First Sunday of Advent, Second Sunday of Advent, Third Sunday of Advent, Fourth Sunday of Advent. But the third one it has been known as Gaudete Sunday, which I know is a ridiculous Latin word, but it's Joy Sunday. And it's been known as that for several hundred years, to the point where the Catholic and Episcopalian churches, at least, actually have pink fabric decorations for the sanctuary and vestments for the clergy to wear, just for that one Sunday. If you've ever seen a church decorated in pink, or a pastor wearing some kind of pink garment, it's almost always because it's Gaudete Sunday of Advent. I suppose another thing about Advent is that John the Baptizer shows up all the time.
Yep. Everywhere. We'll get into, who we think John the Baptizer might be. And sometimes he's different people. In Harry Potter. We relate to him through different Harry Potter characters. But
right.
Our first Sunday of Advent begins with Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 14 through 16. Through God, Jeremiah prophesies that a righteous descendant of David will come to enact righteousness, save Judah, and make Jerusalem safe. So one of the overarching themes that I noticed in this reading was prophecy. And especially, this is really tricky, especially for Christians, because as Christians, we frequently read into the Hebrew Bible that the prophecies are about Jesus, which is supersessionism. And one of my Hebrew Bible professors, who I love, Dr. Klein, used to say, it's not that God was necessarily talking or promising about Jesus, but God makes promises through the prophets for the people. And then whether it's through Jesus or through other people, God always ends up exceeding God's own promises, right? So like God will make a promise, and we hear this promise in Jeremiah, and then God does even more than that. There's even more grace and even more love. And so as Christians, we understand that that's what God is doing in Jesus. But it's also important to recognize that Jeremiah is not actually talking about Jesus.
The prophet Jeremiah was not Christian.
Right. And that made me think about in the magical world, especially with the prophet about Harry and Voldemort, that the magical world all read into the prophecy that it was about Harry and Voldemort. And that was a reading that was not necessarily true, right? There's prophecies that have question marks about who they're about and that sort of thing. And that prophecy in particular could have been about Neville and Lord Voldemort. And so that just was kind of this weird connection of reading things in that may or may not have originally been there.
Before we jump to the next thing, could we give a quick definition of supersessionism to our listeners?
Yes. So supersessionism happens when Christians read Jesus into the Hebrew Bible, like I was mentioning, but then also look at Jesus and read in the Gospels that Jesus is taking over or abolishing all of his Jewish faith and understanding in his Jewish people. And so that, like, all of the commandments are null and void, when in fact, there are different places in the Gospels where Jesus says, I've come to fulfill them. I've come to, like, dives deeper in them and abolish them. Right, so it's not a cohesive thing, but Christianity a lot of the time will say, this is what Jesus has done, and it means that, like, the whole Hebrew Bible is totally out and totally pointless. And it's like, no.
That's
the
not
Hebrew
true.
Bible is really wonderful and life-giving.
And Christianity does not exist to replace or destroy Judaism.
Right. Yep. They both exist, and they both coexist.
Yes, although the church has been kind of terrible about that at times.
Oh, yeah.
Or regularly. But we're trying.
The church is pretty bad at a lot of things. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Like the rest of humanity.
Yeah. I also noticed the fulfillment of promises, which made me think about Petunia's fulfillment of the promise to raise Harry, and the ways that fulfillments of promises can be life-giving, or like I just talked about, right? That God can fulfill God's promises above and beyond, and that is definitely not what Petunia did.
No, that was obligatory, bare minimum.
Yep, letter
making
of the
sure
law
he didn't actually
kind of
die while in her house, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yep.
And in this passage, one of the things that makes this all a little fuzzy is that this passage promises that Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will be a sanctuary, basically. And Judah, during Jesus' time, was not saved from the Romans, at least. And Jerusalem was definitely not a very safe place to exist and be a Jewish person in Jesus' time because of the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And so this prophecy is not that straightforward. It's not about what people thought it was going to be about.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, we've also seen that in the Harry Potter books, because goodness knows some of Trelawney's prophecies were fulfilled in ways that no one really expected.
Yeah, and part of that's tricky is Trelawney's prophecies, like, in a sense, did come true, right? But just,
Right.
like you said, not the way people thought. She didn't get the credit for them.
Yeah.
More specifically, I was thinking about verse 14, the beginning of this short passage, and how ominous it sounds as it starts. So it says, "The days are surely coming, says the Sovereign One, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah." And whenever I hear "the days are surely coming," it just feels ominous to me. And that reminded me of the way that the Half-Blood Prince started, right? The way the sixth book starts is like all of these signs and portents of like terrible things, and Snape encountering, right? Like everything is just like, what is happening? Is this good? Is this bad? Yeah. And then Deathly Hallows certainly steps that up a notch too.
Yeah. When we reach verse 15, much to what may have been my childhood surprise, this verse is not actually where the concept of Christmas trees comes from. Prince Albert brought them with him to England from Germany when he married Queen Victoria, and they spread quickly around Europe and Western civilization after that. But the Christmas trees that are ever present at Hogwarts during the season of Christmas are a great commentary on religious exclusiveness in Western civilization. We saw all kinds of Christmas trees at Hogwarts, and yet not one menorah, and yet not one Diwali celebration. I wouldn't expect to see Kwanzaa there because I really think that's more of an American thing, but there are no other holidays being celebrated at Hogwarts in winter, which is weird because there are a whole boatload of holidays that happen for many, many different religions and also national holidays around Europe that happen during that time period.
And you would think that they'd at least have like some of the pagan traditions, right? Like it's that's where they're from.
They don't bring up a Yule log. Maybe that was Ms. Rowling desperately trying to convince people that she wasn't out to convince people to be Satanists. I don't know.
Right. But, well, and like the Yule Ball is probably the closest they get to that. But there is like J.K. Rowling was challenged on the lack of religious diversity, and so then she was like, "Oh, there's a Jewish character, Anthony Goldstein, who like all we know about him is that he gets sorted into Ravenclaw."
Yeah, and his name, and that's
it.
And reading verse 15, I have to wonder what would happen if the Christmas trees at Hogwarts had their branches spring up and execute justice and righteousness on that account. But
get rid of their own symbolism.
Yeah, I could see that ending badly. Christians, of course, will take the branch of David to be Jesus, but Jeremiah, again, certainly wouldn't have. Our second reading for this Sunday is from 1 Thessalonians, chapter 3, verses 9 through 13. The author gives thanks for those who receive the letter and prays that God will increase their faith, love, and holiness.
As I was reading this letter, I couldn't help but, or this passage, I couldn't help but imagine this as a letter that maybe Remus writes to Harry, or the Weasleys write to Harry, Ron, and Hermione, in the seventh book, right? After Remus goes back to Tonks and like realizes that Harry was right all along, right? But this prayer of thanksgiving for the work that they're doing, and this prayer for them, for faith and for love and for holiness and for the work that they're doing in trying to stop Voldemort.
When we reach verses 9 and 10, this part feels kind of like a roller coaster to me. It sounds like he's saying, "You're awesome, but I really want to restore what's lacking in your faith." Wait, hang on, what?
You're awesome, except for this thing.
Yeah. It reminds me of the stuff that Ron ends up saying to Hermione when he's in his spectacularly awkward crush phase, and he winds up insulting her instead of complimenting her. This is not an example you should be following, by the way, just to make sure that you know that. It's one of the things that people do wind up doing when they feel really awkward about what they're trying to say.
Yeah. So. Ron is probably one of the like worst role models for how to flirt and try to be in a relationship with someone. As well as it made me think of Howard Wolowitz on The Big Bang Theory, that like he always has a new like tactic for securing a woman, and it's all like ridiculous and patronizing and sexist and all of those things. But at one point, he literally, and he tries this with Penny, and it's hilarious because he says it's a backhanded compliment, right? Like you say something.
Negging?
Yeah.
Is the word?
Yes,
yeah.
Negging. So you say something that sounds like a compliment, but really is like intended to make them feel like less good about themselves.
Oh, that shirt makes you look way less fat.
Yeah, like that. And Penny just like either, I don't think she actually decks him, but she is like, say that again and I'm going to punch you. Right? Like she's just like, no. And shuts that down, which is brilliant because Howard Wolowitz needs to be shut down a lot. As does Ron when he says those ridiculous things trying to like flirt/interact with Hermione.
He does much better when he just tries to be a person. And
right?
I still love the passage where he says, we have to go check on the house elves, and then Hermione kisses him.
Right.
Because that was not him trying to get in with Hermione. That was him having absorbed what she said over the years. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that was
and
great.
Caring about things, and yeah.
And to look at verse 9, where it talks about being joyful before God, who is it that makes us joyful before God? For Harry, in the first book, I'm thinking probably every time I read that description of the first banquet, I think the house elves in the kitchen, even though he hasn't met yet. But boy, is he happy they exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's he opening a whole new world to him where he doesn't actually have to be hungry all the time. Awesome.
Yep. Like he's impressed by the snacks on the train, but the
description
joy
is really
and the wonder that he gets at the banquet is fantastic.
And the movies did a really nice job with it too.
Mm-hmm.
And by book 7, I'm thinking it's probably his pillow, because by that point the sleep deprivation was pretty severe.
Yep. And that's, I mean, after the Battle of Hogwarts, when he's like, everybody's sitting around in the Great Hall, he's like, I just want, like, he's imagining if he could go back to his 4-poster bed and take a nap, and maybe Creature would bring him a sandwich. Right? Like, that's all he wanted. He just wanted to rest. And in verse number 12, we hear this call to unity and to loving one another, even in the face of whatever may come and divisiveness. And it reminded me of Dumbledore's speech at the end of Goblet of Fire, and frequently the part of that speech that is quoted is the part that's the difference between what is right and what is easy. But I also really loved the way that Dumbledore, so it's when all of the when all of the schools are still there, after Karkaroff has fled, and Dumbledore says, every guest in this hall will be welcomed back here at any time, should they wish to come. And then he continues to say that in the light of Lord Voldemort's return, we are only as strong as we are united, as weak as we are divided. Lord Voldemort's gift for spreading discord and enmity is very great. We can fight it only by showing an equally strong bond of friendship and trust. Differences of habit and language are nothing at all if our aims are identical and our hearts are open. And there's a little bit of like minimizing difference, but this emphasis on the only way to combat Voldemort's fear and divisiveness is through extra emphasis on love and trust.
Advice we can use in daily life.
So much right now. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 21, verses 25 to 36. Jesus says that great changes and portents are coming at an unexpected time, and we must remain alert. So this idea that in the midst of a crumbling world, there is actually hope to come. And the imagery that Jesus uses in this passage is of a fig tree. And I was thinking about in the midst of the 6th and 7th books, right, where everything just feels like it's going terribly. Yeah. Even in the midst of that, we get the birth of Teddy Tonks and this hope, right? There's a way in which...
And Bill and Fleur get married.
Yep. And there's a way in which this intentionality of creating family or expanding family, giving birth, is resistance to the idea that there is no hope, right? It is a very enfleshed way of saying there is hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, I felt like more specifically in verse 25, I just got this image of Ferenz teaching divination, right?
See, I immediately said to myself, Harry, this is why you should have paid more attention during astronomy class. Stop falling asleep.
I did think of astronomy class too, but there was just this like way of Ferenz like looking at the stars and everything and like looking at them, and then also the way that they impact the earth and centaurs and their ability to divine things. In verse 26, the concept that people will faint from fear really sounded like the second half of Order of the Phoenix, all the way through the middle of Deathly Hallows, as well as the political climate now, right? Where there's so much fear that is being spread and sown that people don't trust, and people
not just in America.
Yep.
Even. Yeah.
And it's not even just fainting, right? People are dying because of the fear that others have.
But remember, when we talk about Harry Potter, teenage boys from the 90s don't faint. They have manly temporary cessations of consciousness. Teenage girls from the 90s don't faint either because they're too busy getting the teenage boys' work done. Thanks, Hermione. And then when we reach verse 32, I have to say, every so often we hit one of those Bible verses where we just like to remind you that Christian clergy are confused by this one too. And this is one of them. It says, Jesus says this generation will not pass away until, and, well, the thing is, that generation, as far as we're aware, have died. And yes, there's eternal life, so maybe that's what Jesus meant. There's a whole bunch of different theories. Mm-hmm. Personally, I kind of doubt that whole generation of people is made up of secret immortals who are living in a little town in Washington State and sparkle in the sunshine. Mostly because none of those people were white, so that seems very unlikely. But you never know. There's always different ways.
They could be the ghosts extra ghosts at Hogwarts.
Oh goodness!
But then they still would have died. So, yeah.
Yes, and Hogwarts doesn't need more ghosts. It sounds like they've got plenty of those around already.
That's true.
It's okay to be confused by the Bible. Mm-hmm. Everybody is. That's fine. Mm-hmm. Even if they don't admit it.
Yep. And that's part of the joy of the Bible, is that we get to wonder about these things and say, I wonder what they were thinking when this was written down, and I wonder how this impacted them.
Yes. For the second Sunday in Advent, our first reading is from Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. The prophet Malachi says that God is sending a messenger who will refine and purify the people.
So one of the themes in this passage is preparation. And it got me thinking, and I think there's a quote from Harry in the movies about this, but it's so funny to look back on all of the different preparations that and it happens in Deathly Hallows when they're getting ready to go to Hogwarts, and Hermione's like, no, we have to come up with a plan, and then Harry's like, we always come up with a plan, and 30 seconds in, we just have to make stuff up. It gets ruined. But they so frequently, right, their plan to get into the ministry and all of this stuff is a plan, and it gets them maybe to start or into a place, and then you just gotta wing it.
Yeah. Although, frankly, I think Harry enjoys winging it, but that's okay too.
Well, yes, he is a Gryffindor.
He turns out to be pretty good at it in the end.
It's true.
For the most part.
So then I was thinking about, for verse 1, and this idea of preparation and who the messenger is to prepare the way. And my first gut is to say, who's preparing the way for Harry? But then I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, or was Harry the one preparing the way, right? Harry preparing the way for Kingsley to come and be a prime minister who actually, is competent and does a good job, as opposed to, Fudge and Scrimgeour and Pious Thickness.
I've always wondered if Percy actually winds up going back to the ministry and working there again. I mean, I realize he quit right before his brother died, but he did know his way around the ministry, and presumably they're going to need people who knew their way around the ministry and weren't actively evil.
Yeah.
So
I feel like if he did, he became aware enough to know, okay, I have to put
Oh, I'm
limits
sure he
on
went through some
my
changes.
ambition and, like, make sure that that's
Yeah.
all kept in check. Also, one of the things that comes up in verses 2 and 3 is the idea of refining. And frequently, one of the impacts of terrible theology is to take any experience that's a terrible experience and credit God with trying to refine us. And so that, I think, right, that is a terrible...
God is trying to test you. I am currently listening to the audiobook version of Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, I think is the title, by Kate Bowler. And she's doing a wonderful job of just tearing that one to shreds.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and I think it would be, like, in that vein, if we were to use that terrible theology, we would think about, like, the abuse that Harry suffers from the Dursleys.
Made
as,
him stronger,
like,
so that he can...
Right, and that's... I'm not going to say that word because that's not a word that we're using on this podcast. That's wrong.
Yeah, I came up with several of those myself.
Yeah, right, like, that's wrong. That's terrible theology. It's harmful, and it's, in and of itself, it is abusive theology. So, just to be clear, that's not what refining means.
And I would also say that that kind of bad theology has a parallel in the Harry Potter books, because that is totally what Voldemort thought he was doing to wizardkind, right? He thought that he was refining and purifying wizardkind by getting rid of the Muggleborns. And so when we use this kind of language, refining and purifying, especially when it comes to religion, we need to have some delicacy and acknowledge the real-life ugly history behind it, and the fictional history behind it, even, when we use these words.
Yep, and that's what's happening right now with all of the white supremacist and white nationalist stuff, is the conversation about it, and the way that white supremacists speak is to say that they think that they're purifying humanity and they're refining humanity, and that, again, is wrong and racist and terrible and awful theology and just wrong. Like, I don't know, we could probably find more words to say it's wrong, but it's just wrong and abusive.
You probably want this podcast to end eventually, so this episode. We can't go into quite as much depth as we'd like.
Right. But one of the examples of refining that I did think of that actually feels like refining to me is Hermione's journey. I think her journey is a journey of a lot of refining, right? When we first encounter her, and admittedly it's through Harry's perspective, so it's a little bit skewed. But when we first encounter Hermione, she is a 100% rule follower, 100% books are always right, 100% teachers are perfect. And then...
She's 11, cut her some slack.
Right, cut her some slack, but that's what refining is for. It's for growing in our understanding. And so as she gets to know Ron and Harry, and then they have the encounter with the troll, she figures out that maybe there's more to life than following exact rules, because if they had followed the exact rules, I mean...
somebody probably would have wound up dead.
Right, or, I mean, there's also the question of whether or not the troll would have been locked in the bathroom with her, but... But then that continues, and as she gets to know Hagrid, and then Hagrid's difficulty trying to raise a dragon in a wooden hut, that helps her... she starts to realize that the relationship she has with Hagrid and is more important than staying in bed at night or staying inside after dark, after hours, to, being willing to cast Petrificus Totalis on Neville so that they can go and try and save the Sorcerer's Stone. And then as book 2 happens, right, Lockhart's deception, and she realizes how Lockhart, both in the books and as a teacher, deceived her and so many other peoples, and all of these little points.
One of my favorite moments for her is in book 4, when she and Mr. Weasley have the conversation about how a person treats their house elf is a better sign of the type of person they truly are than how they treat someone who has power over them or who is their equal.
Yep. And those, right, all of those little moments lead to Order of the Phoenix, when she challenges Umbridge and she says that what is written in their textbook is not right, right? And she never would have done that in their first couple of years.
No.
But because she's had all of these refining moments, she gets to the point where she understands and values things more than following the rules and obeying authority. And that's when we really start to see her come into her own in a really powerful way, I think.
And help create Dumbledore's army. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for all those years she'd been watching all those troublemakers and learning from them, because she turns out to be pretty good at trouble when she needs
She's
to be.
awesome at it.
Yeah. So I love that about her.
One of the gifts we have in Advent is that some of the psalmodies, which usually are the Psalms, which Kay and I don't really address as much because there's so much else in the other readings. But in Advent, the psalmodies, not every time, but multiple times, are not from the Psalms. And so in those cases, we'll have other psalmodies and we'll address them. And so the psalmody for the second Sunday in Advent is Luke chapter 1, verses 68 to 79. Zechariah praises God at the birth of his son, John the Baptizer. So this Zechariah is praising God and talking about the faithful covenant that God has made with God's people. And I was thinking about the different covenants that are made in Harry Potter, and at first I couldn't think of any. And then I realized that Dumbledore's army is probably one of the few explicit covenants, at least, in Harry Potter,
yes.
Right? Because they all have to...
Even if the consequences aren't really outlined until they take place.
Right, like the consequences of the covenant are not outlined. And the consequences of covenants are not always outlined or known completely, but everyone in the DA has to sign the piece of paper to say that they're going to be in the DA and they're not going to tell anybody, and they just don't know that Hermione magicked the piece of paper and so that they would be revealed if they ever did snitch.
Right.
But that was the only real covenantal relationship.
The order might have one behind it, but we don't really witness it.
Mm-hmm.
When we reach verse 74, and this bit about serving without fear, I think that we talk a lot in this podcast about how Dumbledore was not at all perfect, and that's true. But this is a distinct difference between him and Voldemort. People could serve Dumbledore without fear, or at least without unnecessary fear.
Mm-hmm.
He might eventually wind up asking them to risk death, but if he did that, it was because there was a reason for it. It wasn't just because he was in a temper that day. He didn't punish people for his moods, that kind of thing, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And aside from that bit in the movie where he wonders whether or not Harry has put his name into the Goblet of Fire, and the movie version is
well, the movie version is not accurate.
I have trouble taking that. Yeah, I have trouble taking that scene seriously because the actor was just having such a grand old time hamming it up.
I also thought in verse 74 about the difference between the narrow escapes. So when Harry has a narrow escape, his response is usually of gratitude, of like trying to do better, those sorts of things. Sure. And when Draco has a narrow escape, he just goes back to doing what he does because he's so caught up in fear frequently, right? Like, right. In Half-Blood Prince, when he narrowly escapes, like getting in he's trying to kill Dumbledore and he doesn't succeed and he narrowly escapes. And then he has to double down on blood purity because it's the only way he knows of to stay safe. Or in the Battle of Hogwarts, right? Harry saves his life multiple times, and yet Draco still is trying to be on the side of the Death Eaters and still trying to, like, be okay from the Death Eaters.
When we reach verse 79, there's this light and darkness imagery, and I don't know that we've talked in the podcast about this before, but these days there are people who are starting to question how we use and how we talk about the light versus darkness imagery in the Bible. I mean, there's a lot of it. But the thing is that imagery has been used in some really racist ways in the past, and in some places still is. And also, let's acknowledge the fact that darkness, as an absence of light, is not actually actively evil. So
God shows up in the darkness a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And anyone who's ever had a migraine or is photosensitive for some reason knows that the darkness can be very comforting and relaxing. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But we get this bit about those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death. And I immediately think of Harry in Book 7, having died, meeting Dumbledore in the "this is not really a train station."
Mm-hmm.
And every time I read that scene, it's so different from the rest of the book for so many reasons, Harry being dead, not least of them. But it's the way that Harry is, the way that Harry acts in that scene is so different, because it seems like he's finally relaxed. I mean, it's over. He's dead. He can rest now. In the end, of course, he goes back. But
Mm-hmm.
the deep calmness to him in that scene is so extraordinary compared to how scared and terrified and nervous he's been for so long. And I think that's an example of the darkness not being a bad thing. He goes to the shadow of death, and it turns out to be restful for him for this brief time period.
Yeah, and I think of the various times when I've been with people who are in hospice, right? And that
Yes.
approach to death is not always a terrifying thing. It is not always a painful thing. It can be really calm, and it can be really restful. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the ways that I've heard in maybe the last year or two has been people using shadow language instead of dark and light, right? To think about times being really in the shadow, that it's not, you can't really see things super clearly. I really like dull and vivid or bright, because I think part of what we're trying to get at is, being from Colorado, I think about the Midwest in the winter, right? It's just dull and gray, and so there's not...
On some days.
On most days.
The day after it snows, when the sun comes out and it's really bright and you get snow blindness no matter where you go, that always seems vivid and bright to me.
Yes.
In fact, I think that's brighter than summer.
Yes, but we don't even get... It is actually brighter than summer because you get the reflection off of the snow. But in the Midwest, that doesn't happen very often. At least I feel like it doesn't happen very often, because I come from Colorado, where it happens like 360 days of the year.
Yeah.
But that dullness, that's what wears on me, right? That's part of what wears on people day after day of not
February.
having those vivid
I hate
colors.
the month of February.
And so then thinking about God's presence and the vividness, even when it is like really this like dark inky black, or this bright vivid blue, or the white of snow and the sparkliness of snow. Not that snow is a vampire, but that's how I think about those. That's how I use, if I'm gonna create a duality there. Also, I think it's hilarious that you and I both picked the same two verses. We're like, this verse stands out to me.
This seems to keep happening for us. For the record, we don't actually do our planning together. We do it separately and then come together and see what each other has. And so often we both have a comment on one verse and completely ignore like 5 other verses. And they're all the same. Yeah. But at least we come up with different ideas. So
yeah. So when I was looking at verse 79, I was thinking about who guides us into the way of peace in the books, and I just love Luna, as like she just feels peaceful to me. But then I was thinking about it more, and I realized that it really is Xenophilius, Lovegood, and the Quibbler that call us towards repentance, right? And that call us towards this turning back towards God, turning back towards what is true, insofar as the Quibbler, right, names the need to support Harry and the problems with the Ministry of Magic and stuff, up until the point where Voldemort's folks capture Luna.
Yeah. Our next reading is from Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 through 11. The author gives thanks for the recipients of the letter because of how they have shared God's grace together.
Gratitude is definitely at the heart of this letter. And I think one of the places where we see gratitude come up most clearly is in Deathly Hallows, when Hermione and Harry go to visit Godric's Hollow, and they go and they're walking towards Harry's childhood home, and the sign comes up that says what it is, that only appears for magical folks. And
Right.
all over the sign, people have written messages of love and appreciation and encouragement to Harry. And Hermione goes,
Yeah.
"Oh, they've been like desecrating the sign." She doesn't say that exactly, but she is like upset that people are writing on the sign. And Harry's just like, "No, this is perfect." Because not only does he get that encouragement, but then anytime anybody comes to that place, they get to see that they're not alone.
Yeah.
In verse 3, I thought about if anybody at Hogwarts or in the Harry Potter books really has anyone for whom every time they think of them, they give thanks to God. And I think Fred and George have that sort of relationship where they are just constantly like, they bring joy to each other. And even Lee Jordan in their kind of trio of friendship.
Yeah, I would say that.
It seems filled with joy and gratitude kind of things.
When we reach verse 6, my immediate reaction is that I still cannot imagine being Harry and accomplishing both goals in your life. He had two goals, as far as I can tell: having a place in the world with friends,
Mm-hmm.
and stopping the guy who killed his parents. I don't really think he was out for vengeance, but stopping Voldemort. And he does both of those by the time he's 18. And so, as, frankly, a millennial, a zennial, really, I can't imagine what it means to bring one's work to completion, as the verse puts it. It seems to me like all the goalposts have been moving further and further away since I was born. So the whole concept of that is just bizarre to me.
Yeah, well, and in psychology class in high school, we talked about, we had to make a list of 100 goals, and my teacher talked about one of the guys on one of the Apollo missions had, like, his goal was to be an astronaut, to go to space, to go to the moon, whatever. And he actually, like, because he never moved the goalposts, because he never then set other goals, once he accomplished that, he actually lost a lot of the meaning of his life because he hadn't set any other goals. There was no other purpose for him. And so I think it's important that the goalposts keep moving until we're at the end of our life, right?
Right. And I love that verse 9 says that love overflows through more knowledge and insight. And I've had some interesting conversations about that before, whether it really does or not in life. I would say that Harry comes to understand his parents and Sirius and Remus better over time, including their flaws, maybe except for Lily. Not really sure Lily has any.
She doesn't. She's perfect, just like Mary.
And I wonder if he loved them more because he knew them better. And I think he loved them more truly as themselves, for being themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that in part because I've been married for about 6 years now, and I definitely love my husband better and more fully as himself now than I did on our first date or even on our wedding day. But I also have to acknowledge that not everybody gets that arc in life. Most divorces happen in the first 10 years. And sometimes when you get to know someone better, sometimes that knowledge and insight really makes you love them less. So it kind of depends. I would hope that our insight increases as we get older, though.
Yes. And I think that part of why, the author of Philippians says this, and why we think that more knowledge and insight increases love, is the understanding of empathy, right? To be able to understand where people are coming from. And that definitely is the case with Snape and Harry, right? It doesn't happen until after Snape is dead, but there's empathy that Harry has because he understands more what Snape's life has been like and why he's been doing the things he's been doing. There's also this great fanfic that I read that we'll try and find the post for about Umbridge and like things written from the perspective of Umbridge, who is just, I think you shared one of them, but I know I got another from a group. But Umbridge is just trying to do her best in a complicated world, and she ends up going down this path that is really complicated and problematic.
Yeah.
But she's just trying to do her best. And so that
I mean, she's not a mustache-twirling evil villain who's out to be evil.
Yeah.
She's more complicated than that.
So we'll share a couple links probably about that to, try and increase a little bit of the empathy.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for the second Sunday in Advent is from Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. John the Baptizer begins his ministry in a particular time and place and prepares the way for Jesus. The beginning of this passage is all about precision and placing John in this particular historical context. And the place that I think precision comes up the most in Harry Potter, in addition to like how you say spells and whether it's Wingardium Leviosa or Wingardium Leviosa, the other place is the Horcruxes, right? Throughout the 6th book, Dumbledore and Harry are trying to get at what the full scope of what Voldemort has done is, and it is to dig into the Horcruxes and what happened in the Horcruxes, how many Horcruxes Voldemort made, where they are, all of those things, and it's like you just need that precision. Or you could find the precision probably in Hermione's history notes, because she would take the notes that would say everything about everything.
Yeah, absolutely. When I read verse 1, I have to admit that during introduction bits like this in the Bible, I always get a song from Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, not the Disney version, with the royal names stuck in my head. And I'm not going to sing it for you because I like you better than that. But it always comes to me in the voice of Jason Alexander in the very racially diverse casting from the 90s with Whitney Houston and Brandy, which, by the way, you can watch for free on YouTube, and we'll put the link in the notes. Yes, I realize that this is not a Harry Potter reference. I don't care. It's the most awesome version of Cinderella I've ever seen.
And there are a few Twitter accounts that our HP at Church Twitter account follows that they try to place every single event. So frequently I'll see, when I'm logged in as us, I'll see tweets about this day and this in like so many years ago, this particular thing happened. And it's stuff where I'm like, I love Harry Potter. And maybe it's just that I'm not paying attention to that aspect of it, but it's like, how do you even get like that it happened on October 15th of 1990 whatever?
The lovely thing about an enthusiastic fandom is that someone will always do the math.
Yep.
For verse 2, I looked back at the beginning of Luke when we learned that John was about 6 months older than Jesus. So he's probably about 30 when we get to this passage here in chapter 3. And he's already in the desert. And God tells him to go get to work, and so he does. But come on, man. He's such a slacker. He waited until he was 30 to get going. He couldn't have started 19 years earlier like, any young adult literature hero would have. Seriously.
Or at least 14.
Seriously.
Right? Like,
yeah, sure. I can give him a couple extra years to, get
like
some
he's
height.
not Harry,
fine,
so.
Yeah. Not everybody's Harry. Or Hermione. We can live with that. Also, shouldn't he have an animal sidekick? Doesn't every hero need an animal sidekick? He eats the locusts. I don't really think that counts. But
I don't know that locusts quite count either. Yeah, a lot of them do have animal sidekicks. Some of them don't. Katniss doesn't.
Well, yeah, she spends most of her time, hunting them, so I don't think that counts either.
Oh, there is that cat, though.
Yeah, true.
And in verse 3, I'm always struck by how terrible Harry is at repentance. Like, it never really sticks, because repentance is about turning and going a new way, going a new direction, doing a new thing, doing things differently. And, I mean, we could use Order of the Phoenix, but even in the Sorcerer's Stone, after Harry and Hermione get in trouble for the dragon, Harry's like, nope, no more messing around, no more breaking the rules, I'm done, like, my curiosity, I'm done, I'm not gonna snoop, I'm not gonna do any of that. And he holds to it fairly well because there's nothing to snoop on. And then when there's something to snoop on, he's like, oh no, the stone, I have to intervene and make sure people know this and make sure people know that. And oh no, Dumbledore's not here, so I better go save the stone. And he does end up saving the stone. But it's like, I thought you weren't going to snoop.
Yeah. And then, we get 6 more books of him messing around. And that might have been a plot device.
Just perhaps maybe a little bit. This is, I think, the first time that I was really struck by this, but in verses 4 through 6, when John is quoting Isaiah, right, it talks about making straight the paths of the Lord. And I mean, as a queer person, like maybe not straight, but the crooked shall be made straight and the rough ways smooth. The mountains will, every valley shall be filled and every mountain and hill shall be made low. And I just, for the first time, and this is my own like privilege, for the first time I was like, oh my gosh, it's not just that like God's making the path for the people in exile to come back, which is what Isaiah is talking about, but it's making an accessible path, right? They don't have to climb mountains to try and get back. It is a clear, direct, smooth path back home. And so then I was thinking about like, if Isaiah were to talk about Hogwarts, what would it be? And it'd be, you know, the missing steps are filled in and flying carpets are provided, right? So that people whose legs can't carry their weight can still get around.
Yeah.
That would be really cool.
Yeah. And now we've reached the third Sunday of Advent, and the first reading is from Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 14 through 20. The prophet Zephaniah calls the people to rejoice with God as a warrior who will bring Israel victory and gather up the disabled and outcasts in triumph.
So this rejoicing in adversity theme that's in this reading from Zephaniah is a lot of what Dumbledore's army does right under Umbridge's nose, right? The joy that they get from gathering in spite of her many educational decrees, or Fred and George and all of the pranks that they pull that are specifically to disrupt Umbridge, right? They take a break during the breaks because they don't want to disrupt people's studying. They just want to disrupt Umbridge, and they want to bring joy in the midst of all of the like pain and misery that she is causing.
Yeah. And this passage is so enthusiastic about victory and celebration, and that's great, but what it seems to ignore in all of its triumph over oppression language is that there is very rarely a party, at least immediately after a hard-fought battle, because everybody's exhausted, and there's been all this destruction, and someone has to deal with the bodies and the fires and so on. And I'm sure Harry knew this. So was it that the prophet knew this and was just trying to give hope, or was the prophet speaking out of ignorance? Zephaniah. Or this being God, maybe God can, deal with all that stuff and we don't have to.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because, I mean, at the end of the Battle of Hogwarts, it's not celebration, it's exhaustion, and it's Harry just, like I mentioned earlier, Harry just wants to be in his bed with maybe a sandwich from Creature.
Yeah.
And that's partly why in verse 17, when I was thinking about verse 17, the thing that struck me was not the end of the Battle of Hogwarts, but it was when Harry goes after Harry's trial in front of the whole Wizengamot in Order of the Phoenix. When he comes back, everybody, right, Hermione, Fred and George, everybody are like dancing around in circles and chanting, he got off, he got off, he got off. And that's celebration, but they weren't the ones who lived through it, right? It takes kind of this outside perspective of joy and celebration and people who were supporting that, but maybe weren't actively involved in it to have that joy.
Yeah. We reach verse 19, and I think that guilt and shame are different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Guilt is what you feel when you feel that you've done something bad. It's internal. Shame isn't about whether you did anything bad, actually, but it's about whether you feel bad about who you are because of what you've done, which may or may not actually involve being bad. Shame is put on you by other people. It's not entirely internal. Yep. There have to be other people involved.
That's kind of like when Neville is shamed about his abilities, when he's just as magical as anyone else there. It's that his magical abilities don't fit the mold that his family wanted, that pureblood wizardry would prefer. Mm-hmm.
Some people are just good with plants, and that's not bad either.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he feels so much shame. And just like Neville, the disabled and the outcasts in this passage haven't done anything wrong either. It's just that the shape of society has given them shame.
Mm-hmm.
Society has been formed in such a way that shames them for something that's not their fault. Mm-hmm. And even if it was their fault...
Right, yeah. It's society that says this is wrong and you are bad because of this. It's not that who they are or what they've done is actually wrong or bad. I also thought towards the end of the passage, I thought about the gathering and the returning, and there's just this emphasis that I felt on comfort, right? That God is clearly calling people and comforting them in this. And it reminded me of what it must have been like for Hermione to go find her parents in Australia and fix their memories and return home with them, and that comfort, because Hermione has not been a kid in years, right? She has kept things from her parents. She has not told them. She hasn't been home much, right? But to then finally, at the age of 18, she gets to go home and just be a kid with her parents for a while without all of the other war and stuff going on. Our psalmody for the third Sunday in Advent is from Isaiah chapter 12, verses 2 through 6. The prophet Isaiah exhorts Israel to praise God and share God's deeds with the world. Think about praise. Praise happens a lot for Harry throughout the books, but even in the Sorcerer's Stone, when Gryffindor wins the House Cup, there's a lot of praise for Harry, but particularly because of the way, and for Ron and Hermione, but particularly because of the way Dumbledore announces the points. Neville gets praise for his 10 points, and his 10 points matter so much because that's what makes it so that Gryffindor wins.
Yeah. When we read verse 2, which says, "The Lord God is my strength and my might," I think we've all experienced that sometimes we get our strength from other people. And at various times, there are a bunch of people who are Harry's strength. Ron and Hermione, certainly. Sirius, especially after he gets that offer to go live with him, even if it doesn't work out. Just receiving that offer was huge. Mm-hmm. At one point, his strength seems to come from his dead father, until later on you learn that was Harry himself, and he can cast one heck of a Patronus. So he gets his strength from all different kinds of people. And having that variety, I think, is part of what helped him get through everything.
Yep. In verse 3, when Isaiah says, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." And that made me think of, in the Tales of Beedle the Bard, one of the tales is the tale of the Fountain of Fair Fortune. And partly I remembered it wrong, so I thought it was a well of fair fortune. But the Fountain of Fair Fortune, there's a magical fountain that would provide all of your greatest wishes. And so the story talks about these three people who magically managed to get in together, and in their journey to get to the Fountain of Fair Fortune, all of their greatest wishes that they're hoping the fountain will do are actually accomplished as they go. And it's just it's a beautiful story, but I love the way that it is a fountain of fair fortune. It's something that we strive towards and that we rejoice in, and they actually accomplish those things working together on their own too, which is cool.
Yeah. Our next reading for this Sunday is from Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. Paul encourages his friends to embrace gentleness and peace instead of worrying.
This passage reminded me of the emphasis on depending or relying on God. And as we mentioned in past episodes, the ways that Hermione worries about plans before they happen, and even Harry and Ron do too, but then it always seems to work out, right? There's always a way that it works out, and that they rely heavily on each other. And it's when they rely on each other that things work out. It's when they don't rely on each other, when there's distrust between them, when there's, the power of an evil Horcrux corrupting how they feel, then that's when things aren't working out as well. And so that's that kind of dependence, reliance.
I love the bit in verse 5 where Paul says, "Let your gentleness be known to everyone." And immediately I thought of Luna, like you did earlier, thinking of her when it comes to peace. She is so incredibly gentle with other people, with the animals, that she believes in when no one else does. But she's a little otherworldly, I would say. But gentleness is definitely a core part of who she is. And I wonder, what would Christianity be like if we had taken this verse as being central and ran with it from the start? We have not always been that good at being gentle.
That's for sure. Yeah, as you were saying that, I was struck by, like, I feel like Luna is a mystic, which is this beautiful, like, that otherworldliness. I also think Hagrid's gentleness is really endearing. And he, you know, is not maybe quite as consistent as Luna with gentleness, but he is so gentle, and with creatures especially, and with Harry, right? When he brings Harry for Privet Drive for the first time, and he's just got him, like, cradled, and in so many ways, Hagrid models one of the healthiest forms of masculinity that we find in the books.
Yeah.
Because it's so caring.
Verse 7 is one of the better known verses from this passage. There are pastors who will start or end every sermon with this verse. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just that all of my sermons are different enough that it wouldn't always sound appropriate to what was going on that day. I do end a lot of my sermons with, and for this today and every day we give thanks to God, unless it's, you know, Good Friday or I'm coming down really hard like a ton of bricks on something. But
I do thanks be to God or amen, depending on similar things.
But I was struck by the fact that Dumbledore does not really seem to have a catchphrase, which strikes me as weird because he makes a lot of speeches.
Yep.
And in my experience, people who make a lot of speeches, whether they're pastors making sermons or
politicians.
I immediately flashed back to the president of my college. Politicians, yes. They tend to have certain things that they go back to again and again. And he loves being a little wonky, but that's not really the same thing.
Yeah, he really doesn't. I also thought with that verse about the peace that surpasses all understanding, and the peace that Harry finds, admittedly with the help of the resurrection stone, when he is going to accept that he has to die and that Voldemort has to kill him. And there's just this calm sense of purpose that I think he has that doesn't, it seems illogical to us, particularly those of us who are not facing death and haven't faced death. But Harry's just, it's like, okay, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die, and I'm going to accept this, and then ends up, like, coming back and stuff. But our gospel for this Sunday is Luke chapter 3, verses 7 to 18. John the Baptizer tells the crowds seeking baptism from him to repent and change in response to the baptism by being generous, honest, and loving, and then foretells Jesus' arrival. So repentance, which we've talked about a little bit, but this time I thought of repentance and I thought of Percy. And Percy is kind of one of the few to actually repent. And it takes him a long time. But he shows up for the Battle of Hogwarts, and he greets his family, and he says that he was wrong and that he messed up big time. And there's just this beautiful sense in which he does change. And that's why, as we were talking about it, I was like, I could see him going back to the ministry and putting in place certain things for himself so that he doesn't get too caught up in ambition.
And others.
And others, but especially, like, his own change. And then in verse 8, I was thinking about, John calls people to bear fruits worthy of repentance, and then says, "Do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our ancestor.' For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham." And I just thought about Hogwarts itself, right? Even if none of the students or teachers or magical people fought against Voldemort or fought to defend Hogwarts, Hogwarts itself would and does defend itself.
Yes. And I love that verse for reminding us to not depend on the awesomeness of your ancestors, which is advice that, the Death Eaters could have found very useful. But, God created you. God is not going to be impressed with your family tree. Just keep that in mind.
But humans are. That's why we trace
Well,
Jesus'
yes.
family tree all the way back as far as we can. But yeah, God, that's not how God
works.
Yep. And I thought in verses 10 through 14, I thought about what John would tell the prefects in Deathly Hallows, right? Don't take advantage of your position. Or the inquisitorial squad in Order of the Phoenix. Don't take advantage of your position. If you're going to be in a position of power and authority and potential collusion with an empire, use your position for moderation. Use your position to help care for other people.
Yeah. And when we get to verse 16, I am not suggesting this. This is not something I am saying that you should do. But I cannot believe that we have not had a Christian sect come up somewhere that tries to baptize people using fire instead of water.
Mm.
I'm convinced it's going to happen one day. It's going to happen eventually. I mean, law of large numbers. Eventually, somebody's got to try it. It's not a good idea. Please don't. If you are not Hermione and you do not have fire that doesn't hurt people that you can gather into a jar, do not try this at home. So
yeah, I've heard of people like making it so that baptismal fonts can be lit on fire for Pentecost and stuff, but definitely not for actual baptisms. Like, no way.
No. Fire near babies is never a good combination.
Yeah.
For our final Sunday of this episode, we've reached the fourth Sunday of Advent. Our first reading is from Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 5a. Micah prophesies that a ruler of Israel will come from Bethlehem, born to an ancient bloodline, and bring peace to Israel.
The way that Micah describes this ruler is as a provider, right, who provides for the people. And that made me think of Hermione, especially once she becomes a prefect, right? She definitely takes on the role of provider and protector and caregiver for the first years as she shepherds them and helps them know the password and helps them get to classes and all of that stuff.
In some ways, Hermione is the ultimate mom friend. And she also does this for her parents when she sends them to safety, too. In verse 2, we get this reference to Bethlehem. And I have to wonder, Bethlehem in the Bible was a little town, but it was also the city of David. So it had this powerful history and ancient connections. And I wonder if there's an example of that in Harry Potter. I mean, is that Hogsmeade? This little town with powerful history and ancient connections.
Yeah, or I was thinking about Godric's Hollow as this, right?
Yes.
It's this little village, and yet the history is so deep and so rich, right. And so much ends up happening there that you couldn't have imagined, and all of the connections that Harry doesn't realize until the end with that place. I also was struck in verse 2 by, it reminded me of Neville's comment during one of the Quidditch games where Malfoy is mouthing off, and Neville turns to Malfoy and goes, "I'm worth 10 of you, Malfoy." And just this, like, the power that is in that sentiment of Neville taking seriously his own worth for one of the first times, because so many people have shamed him into thinking he's not worthy and he's not valuable.
Yeah.
Also in verse 4b, the last part of verse 4, it reminded me of the ways that unrealistic expectations are set up. For example, with Harry Potter, aka the boy who lived, that, like, because he was the boy who lived.
He's one. Give him a break.
All of these expectations are placed on him to the extent that strangers come up to him when they see him out shopping with Petunia and all of that stuff. And our psalmody for the fourth Sunday in Advent is from Luke chapter 1, and though it doesn't start until verse 47, we are looking at it beginning with verse 46 through 55 so that it matches up with the gospel. So you can read this as the psalmody, or it can be the second half of the gospel. And Mary, in this passage, Mary compares how God has favored her, an ordinary woman who carries God's own son, with how God lifts up the poor and powerless and overthrows the powerful in her great song of thanksgiving which we call the Magnificat. And I think about the upturning of power, and that happens, and we kind of read into that a lot in the Harry Potter books, but especially after the events at the Ministry in Order of the Phoenix at the beginning of the Half-Blood Prince, the Malfoys are so toppled. Like, admittedly, Voldemort's still meeting in their residence, and that's still where they're having the meetings, but they have lost their favor, and that's why Malfoy is the one who's picked to kill Dumbledore, because Voldemort is counting on Malfoy getting killed in the process, and Bellatrix also has lost her favor because of Remus and Tonks getting married and a werewolf being part of her family now.
You know, I read the Magnificat, and I think about Harry Potter, and I wonder whether there are any women who have a moment like this in the Harry Potter books, having been given great power, great responsibility, and then they get a chance to give thanks for it. Mm-hmm. And I don't really know that I can come up with anybody. I mean, I like to imagine that Hermione or Minerva or someone would have had a moment like this at some point, but we don't get to see it.
Yeah, and I think so frequently when women do get power, it is hard fought for, and
yeah, and you can't really do the giving thanks in public.
Yep, and there's so much that, right, Minerva McGonagall does have power, but she has so many extra responsibilities immediately the second she has any of that power, and it's just ridiculous. Yeah.
Verse 46 is actually one of my favorite verses in the Bible. I love the idea that a person's soul can make God easier to see. And I love discovering new people in my life who do that. And I think Luna does this with her gentleness throughout the books. I think Molly, with her instant adoption of Harry, and you cannot deny she loves her kids and she cares for her kids. She doesn't always show it in the way they would like, but such is life. Yeah. Hermione, with bringing the mighty down from their thrones, particularly when she punches Draco Malfoy in the face. Definitely a favorite moment. And I wonder, did Jesus get to have women, well, people, yes, but at the moment we're thinking about women because this is Mary. Did Jesus get to have people in his life around him like this as a kid? Was he half adopted by his best friend's mom? Did he have a Luna or a Hermione when he was a kid? And how would Mary's personality mix into all this? Was she a Luna? Was she a Hermione? Was she a Molly? Was she a mix of all three of them?
Well, and I think about Mary and Elizabeth, and I could totally see, right, there is this clear connection, and that's what the gospel will show us, the clear connection between the two of them. And I would think that they would not only be raising their kids at around the same time, but that they would love and support each other's kids in those sorts of ways, maybe.
Were they the cool aunt to each other's kids?
I think so.
Yeah.
Verse 52 made me think of how this is not the case in the magical world at all. God has not brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. House elves and muggles are still treated like a little bit less. And it's this idea that is very prevalent, especially in Advent, of living in the already not yet. There's an already, right? Harry Potter wins against Voldemort, and so we know that a different thing is coming, and yet we're still stuck in a lot of the systems of oppression that exist, and that's definitely how we are right now in our country and in our world, where it's Jesus reigns and God has the final say, and yet people are families are still being separated at the border. People are still being turned away at the border. People are still being oppressed.
Dying of
cancer. Synagogues and, right, there's still racism and anti-Semitism and all of that. Verse 55, and the promise made that God makes to our ancestors and to all of the descendants, reminded me, I watched this fan movie called Origins of the Heir, which is a film that kind of looks at Voldemort between the end of Hogwarts and where we pick up with Harry's story, even just like the very, very beginning of Sorcerer's Stone. So, Origins of the Heir, in it, the descendants of the four houses, there's a descendant from each house that's at Hogwarts at the same time. And so they create this pact among themselves to fulfill the promises and the hope of those houses for Hogwarts and for making the world a better place and stuff. And it, of course, all goes haywire because Voldemort's the heir of Slytherin. But that idea of just the descendants, and I'll link to the film. We'll have a link in the blog.
Cool. Our next reading is from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 through 10. The author explains that we have been made holy through Christ's death as a final great offering to God. So the law of offerings has been fulfilled.
Again, we get supersessionism. We get this one leading to another one. And that's, it could be Grindelwald, who then leads towards Voldemort. And so Voldemort takes over as the most evil wizard ever. Or Dumbledore as the greatest wizard or the best wizard or whatever. And then that is...
And controller of the Elder Wand.
Controller of the Elder Wand. Yeah, controller of the Elder Wand especially. And then that becomes Harry. Harry becomes the controller of the Elder Wand. As I was thinking about that first verse in Hebrews, that you have to be enfleshed to be real. You have to have a body to be real. And Voldemort knows this especially, right? He learns that the hard way, that he keeps trying to come back and he never has his own body to come back. And it's not until the fourth book that he finally gets his own real flesh and blood, his own body. Well, I guess it's Harry's blood, but his own body to be alive again and to be real and to have an impact in the world.
In verse 6, we read about God taking no pleasure in offerings, and it reminds me of Harry being wildly uncomfortable with being treated as a celebrity, just throughout. People make their offerings of excitement and wanting to shake his hand, and the guy bows to him in a shop, and he enters the leaky cauldron for a first time and gets mobbed. And he does not enjoy it at all.
Especially once he realizes who he is and what his scar represents. Every single time, everybody has to stare at his scar or tell him that he has his mother's eyes.
Yeah, that's kind of rude.
Yeah. And verse 10, I keep going back to this, I guess, but Harry literally is offering his body, right? When he prepares himself for death, all of this stuff, he is literally offering his body for the sake of others and for his own sake and integrity and stuff.
And goodness knows an ongoing theme of the podcast is parallels between Jesus and Harry. And there is a parallel between Jesus dying to save us and Harry dying to save the wizarding world and possibly also the Muggle world. But we also remember that Harry didn't make anybody holy in the process and also was not himself divine. So there are differences. A parallel does not mean equality.
Yep, and that's our dance, right? Our dance is between, is Harry like Jesus? Or how is Harry not like Jesus also?
Yeah.
Our gospel for this final Sunday in Advent is Luke chapter 1, verses 39 through 45, with the option of also including verses 46 through 55, though as we said before, that we covered in the Psalmody. In this passage, Mary and Elizabeth, cousins who are both pregnant by God's miracle, meet joyfully. Elizabeth gives thanks for Mary, and Mary sings the Magnificat. I am apparently on a huge Luna kick right now. But this idea of blessing, right? Elizabeth blesses Mary, Mary blesses God. I think it's also because of in Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, in a recent episode, they talked about Luna being like the priest of the books and leading the ritual and meaning making and validation of others. And that's so much of her role is to bless, especially when she enters into the story. She blesses Harry with truth and affirmation, right? To say, you're only as crazy as I am because I see them too, about the Thestrals or those little...
And it takes a minute for that to be comforting for Harry, but that's
and blessings aren't always comforting, especially at first, but that she continues to just be this source of blessing.
Yeah.
In verse 39, the first verse, I thought about once Mary is pregnant, she sets out in haste to see Elizabeth, and that reminded me of just like this hurry that Remus has once Tonks gives birth to Teddy, that he just like bursts in and has to and like knocks on the door of Shell Cottage in the middle of a storm, and they have to do the like, how do I know it's you? How do I know it's you? All of these things. But then it's just this bursting with this good news and this joy, and to be telling that to Harry, who then will be the godfather to Teddy. Ah, it's beautiful.
In verse 41, when we get to the relationship between Mary and Elizabeth, I didn't remember at first whether or not Lily Potter and Alice Longbottom knew each other.
I think they...
But
yeah, I think that they did, because they're both in... the Longbottoms and the Potters are both in that picture that Moody... in the books, Moody, in the movies, Sirius, shows Harry at the party for Hermione and Ron.
Right. And so they certainly knew each other. I wonder if, since they were pregnant at the same time, did they get to spend time together then? Did they know that the two children were going to grow up together, at least at Hogwarts? Mm-hmm. Did they know that either of their kid could have been the child of the prophecy?
I mean, I don't think they knew about the prophecy in general, but that is, yeah, I do wonder if they knew that they both gave birth at the same time, right? That they were both on the same track for giving birth and for their kids.
Yeah. And I do wonder how the books would have been different if the prophecy itself had magically given Neville and Harry awareness of each other. Mm-hmm. What if Neville had been Harry's best friend instead of Ron? And the books would have been so different, because Neville was always so much more reasonable and less, let's run off and have an adventure than Ron. I mean, he did adventures, but and goodness knows he grew up plenty brave, but the difference in personality definitely would have made a huge difference in the books.
Yeah, and I think even if the Potters had lived, or if Harry had stayed in wizarding in the magical world growing up, I think Neville and Harry are more likely to have known each other before Hogwarts than Ron, because the Weasleys weren't in the Order of the Phoenix. They were older, they probably just didn't know about it or whatever, but they weren't in the Order of the Phoenix the first time around.
Molly's cousins? Was it? Fabian and Gideon, that Fred and George are sort of named after? I thought they were.
Maybe, but like Molly and Arthur weren't. Yeah.
Right.
Also, for verse 42, this has nothing to do with Harry Potter, but I just love the Hail Mary. My grandmother is Catholic, and so I grew up and I knew the Rosary pretty well. Not nearly to the extent, and I don't know that I could do it anymore, but there's something about the Hail Mary that just is like so beautiful. Yeah. And this lifting up.
And there is a Lutheran version of the Rosary.
There is. But I love the like lifting up and valuing of Mary. And it's just so counter to the patriarchy that is still so present in the church.
Right.
And one of the things I love about Harry Potter and the Sacred Text is that they bless characters every episode. And Vanessa actually only ever blesses women. Yeah. And so sometimes the only blessings are for women. And it's just this beautiful thing.
Thank you for joining us. We'll join you next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day.
This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing, and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP at Church, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on iTunes, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes or get transcripts from the podcast, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. And if you have any great ideas for merchandise, if you want sweatshirts or hats or whatever the case may be,
buttons or stickers,
let us know what your ideas are. You can contact us on any of the previously mentioned modes to let us know.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.